Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Superfeeler podcast. My name is Lori, and I am here today with Amanda Uliaszek, who is an associate professor at the University of Toronto with the STEP Lab. So really excited to hear from her. We've both done Sash Fair sessions before with their expert series, and so I saw hers around stigma and was just like, we have a very similar approach for a strengths-based view of borderline personality disorders. So really excited to chat with you, Amanda. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Like, as you said, I'm Amanda Uliaszek. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Toronto. So I've been doing clinical work with people with borderline personality disorder since about probably 2006 or 2007, when I was a graduate student at Northwestern University in Chicago. And since that time, I've been a professor since 2011. My work has largely focused on dialectical behavior therapy and borderline personality disorder since I've been in Toronto.
Amazing. So are you from the States originally?
Yes, I am.
I was like, you have a slight accent. I can kind of tell. Awesome. So cool. So how did you get involved in borderline personality disorder? Like, what interests you in that work?
So when I was a graduate student in clinical psych, I was working at a clinic. I won't say which one. And I was just getting your kind of standard training on cognitive behavior therapy, like evidence-based training. Like I said, I went to Northwestern University, which is a clinical science program. It's very research focused. So I was doing really exciting kind of therapy with people with mostly depression and anxiety. But the clinic had kind of like a screener for people with borderline personality disorder. So there was slight kind of culture to that people with BPD should not be seen or should be referred elsewhere. At the same time, there was a really wonderful separate kind of clinic within a clinic doing dialectical behavior therapy. And so as a student, it was kind of encouraged that I not, see someone with BPD, that's just way too hard and it's way too dangerous and too treatment resistant. And it's just the terrible kind of place to learn. And I thought, this is something that I am finding really, it's connecting to a lot of like things I'm seeing clinically, but also my research I was focused on personality in general. And so I asked to be trained in the DBT clinic, in the dialectical behavior therapy clinic. And it just seemed that people with BPD should be given kind of equal opportunity to therapy that everyone else had. And especially in the States, if you could see a student, it's so much more economical. You're not getting publicly funded insurance that's going to ever cover any kind of therapy. So that's how I got interested clinically in learning dialectical behavior therapy, treating people with BPD. And then I actually shifted and did my dissertation on personality disorders as kind of a central focus in personality. And so that was back, I guess, nearly going on 20 years ago. So that's kind of how I got started.
I'm like, let's just transition to your skincare routine.
All the filters and the makeup.
Yes. I don't believe that at all.
No one can see that on a podcast. You're setting me up for some people will be disappointed.
No, not at all. I think that's so amazing. I always am so fascinated by it. So especially researchers. I don't know very many researchers that have a personal connection to BPD, but you do so much for our community. And it's not easy, I have no doubt, because even just like going through research ethics with individuals with BPD is more difficult because you've got like, well, they're so risky. What are you going to do if they all kill themselves? And you're like, well, they probably won't. Like, that's not likely to happen. Yeah.
And what a terrible reason to not do more research that's focused on people with BPD. I mean, that's always been a claim too for studying suicide, right? Which is also something we do in my lab is because the Research Ethics Board doesn't want to protect that. It's too risky, and that's a shame.
It's a big huge shame. Yeah. And it's like, well, it's not going to get better if we can't do research on it and actually improve and develop evidence-based tools. Yeah. Big challenge for sure. I've worked in a couple of research situations around BPD, and like, I've never actually had a big issue you know what I mean? Like even asking some pretty intense questions about like self-harm, suicide, most people are pretty comfortable talking about their own story.
Absolutely.
It's the people that don't have that experience that are not comfortable with it, which is super interesting.
Yeah. And, there was some studies like that Marsha Linehan, who the, the creator of DBT, used to kind of pioneer in that she had like template responses that you could send back to the like the Research Ethics Board, because asking questions about suicide does not increase people's suicidality. It doesn't.
Totally. And that's been known forever, like a very, very long time.
It just doesn't. And it lets people be heard. If you tiptoe around it, pretend it doesn't exist, or you communicate like, Lila, I don't want to hear it. Please don't tell me about that. The RB doesn't want me to know. That's just communicating that it's some kind of shameful act to be hidden. And that's also not fair. So yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Not a great perspective when you're thinking about science and research and how some of these institutions have traditionally treated people with BPD or those experiencing suicide.
Yeah. Or even just the silo that you were experiencing in your, was it Northwestern?
Yeah.
Yeah, the silo of like, this is the anxiety depression side. The BPD people are over there. Let's not cross those two. Like, well, a lot of us have multiple challenges, and like we might be presenting right now with like primarily anxiety, but still have BPD on our chart or whatever.
Yeah. And you can see that at even a lot of hospitals right now in Canada. It's very common that there's a mood clinic in the hospital and there's a BPD clinic in the hospital. And I understand sometimes it's a way to kind of triage more quickly. But when we look at reality, is that most people don't fit very neatly into those boxes. And so if you're a clinician in one of those clinics, you really do need to experience like a range of training, because you're going to see a range of people with a range of problems that they need help with.
Yeah. And that's even just the individuals that all have that diagnosis. They vary like snowflakes. Every human being on earth is different. Every human being with BPD is different. Yeah. So some of the work that you've done is around, you call it the transdiagnostic approach to treatment. So that's my understanding of that is like kind of not diagnosis specific treatment. Is that a fair explanation of what that is?
Yes. I've always, in both research, in clinical work, it's just, there's no way. I can't even imagine, unless you're doing some kind of research study that ties your hands, and that's a whole other issue. But that you would ever do the exact same clinical kind of protocol. You'd have the same exact session structure. You do it in the same order with any two people. You just never would. And a lot of times diagnoses will help us maybe where we want to start. But really, there's so much more information that we need to know when we're deciding clinically what to do. It's really more problem focused, symptom focused, strength focused, rather than diagnosis focus. And my research has been the same way. There's a lot of evidence from the clinical psychology perspective that, personality disorders or personality pathology are dimensional, that there's not one version of what BPD is that's different than what everything else is. It's really probably a combination of vulnerabilities and risk factors and different kind of a mixed presentation. And there's some things that people with BPD have in common, of course, but then each person is going to look different. So when I've done treatment studies, or a lot of my studies have focused on, well, maybe there's a few symptoms that we have focused on, like emptiness, for example, is something I'm really interested in. We've done a few studies on that ongoing. But for the most part, we're kind of taking a broad approach to problems with emotion dysregulation, for example. I will say, if I can, Lori, though, this has reflected back on stigma in a different way for me, the transdiagnostic approach, because I think I will admit maybe 10 years ago to be part of the problem, in that I was reluctant to provide the diagnosis of BPD because I was really focused on being very transdiagnostic, and the diagnosis isn't that important. So let's just focus on what's going on with you. And now that I've been working for the last I guess it's been about 3 years working with people with BPD as part of my research. So people with lived experience, they've really opened my eyes up into how important a diagnosis can be to actually help against stigma. And so now the research we do on stigma, though, we do have people self-identify as being someone with BPD.
Mm-hmm.
So for the stigma research, we do ask, like, do you consider yourself someone with BPD? Okay, that's enough said. We don't need to verify that for you or prove it or disprove it. Because now I've come to understand a lot more that besides what research says about diagnoses, a diagnostic label can be something really important to someone's identity. And it's really not up to a clinician or a researcher to take that away from them if they don't want it taken away. So that's kind of I do take a transdiagnostic approach from a research and a clinical perspective, but also want to recognize that when we're talking about stigma, that diagnostic label can be really important to people and carry a lot of positive meaning for them. So I do want to acknowledge that is something I've really learned in working with people with lived experience in the last 4 years.
I so appreciate you saying that, because I do think that there's a lot of clinicians that don't provide the diagnosis because they're afraid of many things. And I think that a lot of those fears are valid. Yes. But, I think about when I got my diagnosis, I was like 18 or 19. I really wish I knew the exact year, but that was, 12 years ago. And it changed my life in the most positive way. Like there was a period of like, oh my God, what is this? But I think that was because of stigma from society and physicians and whatever. But then I was able to find community, build community, understand that I wasn't alone, find treatment options that were going to actually work for me, right? When I did my master's research, it was also self-disclosed. Like, do you have BPD? Yes or no? Like, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to try and do that. Although I have worked on studies where you did have to like actually get diagnosed officially. And the majority of people that I talked to, because it was qualitative, were saying that like it was a really positive experience. Like it was a huge relief for people. There were a few that didn't say that, but the majority for sure, huge relief. And I've heard so many stories of people who aren't given the diagnosis, and then later on when they get their chart or whatever, they find out that like it's been on their chart for 20 years and they could have had this sense of relief 20 years ago, which I think is super wrong.
Yeah, we've worked with people in our research in the past 6 months even who've been diagnosed in their 40s and 50s, where they're just learning about this now, and it's just giving meaning to a feeling of 20 plus years of feeling like I'm the only one in the world who experiences this type of feelings of my emotion, feeling very sensitive, feeling people telling me that I overreact to everything. And I never was able to put a name on it. And now that I have a name, just like what you just said, like I now have a community, I have a place to seek out support, and it's been really life-changing. And I think that's part of the problem is the fragilization of people with BPD, of doctors or whoever not being willing to share that information, assuming that someone with BPD should not have access or can't quote unquote handle their own kind of, and it's a label that we make up these labels. It's not like a blood test. So people should have that information, and then they can do with it what they want.
Yeah, like it's only as valuable as it is to the individual receiving it, but they should at least be allowed to make that decision for themselves, right? Yeah, it's so interesting because I also think that there's a lot of people in the world where it also becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in my opinion. I don't have any actual evidence of this, to be fair. But just from what I've seen, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy for clinicians as well, where they're only giving diagnoses of BPD to the people who are like the most BPD in their opinion. But they're not seeing people like me who like work full-time, have a master's degree, have a happy marriage. I definitely have BPD, but because I don't present as though I do based on their perception of what I should look like, the stigma and stereotypes that they have about people like me are never being challenged, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see like a very kind of singular presentation kind of presented of who gets that information and where a lot of other people could benefit from it and then have access to know, oh, okay, like this is a place I can go for support. This is and plus it removes people who may have different kinds of strengths from accessing and interacting with other people with BPD who may be having more struggles or different strengths. Like it would be helpful to kind of allow everyone to see that there's hope, because hopelessness can be such kind of this defining factor. I mean, when we think about even suicide, the biggest kind of predictors are hopelessness and like not having a sense of belonging or feeling like a burden, those three things, right? And depriving people of their community by removing their access to information about themselves and others is really a way to increase hopelessness and increase or decrease a sense of belonging, for sure.
Yeah. Before we get into like the hardcore stigma talk, which I'm very excited about, you said you focus a lot on emptiness. And that is one of those BPD experiences that is so hard to operationalize.
Oh my gosh. Yes, exactly.
So like, tell us about what that means to you in your research and to the people that you've talked to.
It's literally part of what we're doing right now is setting up a qualitative study of people with BPD and people without, people who acknowledge that they've experienced chronic emptiness and actually get to the root of what this is. So I've done a few studies on emptiness. I think one in press and one that's maybe recently published or about to come out, where we have looked at, okay, can we kind of use research tools to differentiate it from sadness, for example? Is it more related to interpersonal? Because you could think of emptiness, at least it's terribly defined. Everyone defines it different. And so if I'm interviewing you, I'm trying to diagnose you using our gold standard measures of diagnosing a personality disorder. My question for emptiness, which is a symptom of BPD in the DSM, is, do you experience chronic emptiness? That's it. Totally. And then you would either say no, or you could say yes. And I say, okay, you meet the criteria. Or you'd say, I don't know, what is it? And I'd say, you'd know it if you had it.
Totally. Exactly.
We don't have any more. But people have started to really theorize that it could be like physical, like almost physiological, like numbness. It could be loneliness. It could be just feeling listless. Like, I don't know what my goals are. I don't know where I'm headed. And so we've been doing a few studies where can we differentiate them apart? My studies so far have shown that it's most closely related to identity disturbance. So like feeling like I don't have an identity, feeling like I don't know who I am, what I'm doing, or where I'm going. But this is some empirical research. What we are taking a step back right now in a current study and saying, let's just talk to people with BPD qualitatively, because I'm basing those findings on measures that are usually broader than just that. They're like BPD measures in general, personality pathology measures in general. They haven't been influenced by people with lived experience properly. So now we're doing a qualitative study. We're about to launch it, actually. And
cool. I'll put the link in the notes.
Yeah, we just got the research ethics response yesterday. And it really connecting with people and talking with people to figure out, when did it start? What does it feel like? What's the trajectory? Is it like constantly high? Does it peak at certain points? Why are you saying emptiness and not sad? Why are you saying empty and not lonely? And so that's what we're doing.
Like to me, I feel like I would connect dissociation and emptiness in a big way.
Absolutely. And, when we made our interview for it, we then brought it to our advisors of people with lived experience, so not researchers. And that was something they added. We as researchers had left that out.
Yeah.
And so our interview on emptiness has been edited and filled out and created with people with lived experience, so that the questions we're asking are actually relevant to people with BPD, not just like me as a researcher deciding what emptiness is or what I think it is. And so that we're excited to kind of take that to to the next step to really start to understand. It's the least, I think, understood symptom of BPD. And likely it's transdiagnostic, like other people experience it too. But we'll be able to kind of start to think about that. Like, what does it mean for people to experience emptiness a little bit more? So that's kind of like a path of research that's going on right now.
That's so cool. When you've got findings from that, I would love to talk more, because I feel like it's not a symptom that I relate to necessarily, but also my symptoms have changed drastically over the last 12 years. Like in terms of, I feel like DBT almost made me more, I love DBT. It saved my life. I would not be here without it, but it's changed the way that my symptoms present in a significant way. So it's like, but yeah, I don't even know if it relates to me because I don't know what it means. Right. So it's so interesting. I love that you have a lived experience advisory committee or whatever you're calling it.
We have multiple. Yes.
That's so cool. I haven't run into that before. I'm in BC for context. I don't think, because like SFU has a huge BPD, the Pearl Lab with Dr. Chapman, and they're great. I've worked with them before, but not from a lived experience perspective. I don't know if other schools have that. Do you know?
No, in terms of working with people with BPD, it's extremely rare to find researchers that are bringing in people with BPD. It has started to happen in the last 10 years with people with psychosis. So it kind of,
okay, cool.
It's happened in healthcare, in child, youth mental health. Yeah, that's been happening. BPD, it's lagging behind. And so I'm a big proponent of that. It's the thing I'm most excited about. And every time I give a talk, I just gave a talk in Belgium a couple months ago. My whole talk was about why at European Society for the Study of Personality Disorders, it was all about why to bring in people with lived experience when you study personality disorders. So it's something I'm trying to get everybody to do.
Totally. That's so cool. Well, if you ever need help, I'm with you, because that's so important.
We pay. It's like, so
also
if you're
incredibly important.
If you're being asked to participate in something like that, you're lending your very valuable experience. You should be remunerated. You should be brought into research outputs if that's of interest to you. It should be very clear, because I also want to make it clear that we very deliberately and ethically engage people with lived experience, making sure people aren't taken advantage of.
Or tokenized.
It's something really, really,
huge.
Exactly. It's been just extremely valuable, I think.
So cool. The work I do, like my professional work, like outside of this, is in patient engagement for severe mental health, substance use, and criminalization. But so like just all up my alley. I love it so much. But you don't see it with BPD as often, because I think people assume that we can't manage ourselves well enough to be like reliable or whatever, which is so not true. And if you're passionate about something, that's important for your wellness too.
That's been some of the feedback that we've gotten is that this becomes like such an incredible opportunity just to connect. And we do have, and if people want to reach out to me, like we have a lot of resources that we've kind of pulled together to help if researchers are nervous about doing kind of engagement, because they might like, I don't know, like when do I bring people in? How much do I pay them? How do we consider these things ethically? And we do a lot of work with that at the University of Toronto for everything, not just people with BPD, but
but we're not excluded, which is nice. Yeah.
No, not at all.
So talk about stigma. Why is stigma so important for BPD? Why is it so bad? And what are some of the interventions that you're studying?
Sure. So I will say that all the work I'm going to talk about related to stigma, I do this in partnership with one of my PhD students, Maya Amistoy, who is just absolutely excellent. So a future kind of a rock star clinician and psychologist. And so how it all kind of started very briefly was I was working with a new colleague at the University of Toronto, Mike Best, and he was doing a anti-stigma intervention for psychosis. And I don't remember how I was talking about it. It was mid-pandemic. It was like 2020. And I was like, this would be excellent for people with BPD because I have experienced on the clinical side of it. Like I said, my first kind of connection with BPD was being told, oh, we need to screen these people out so you don't have to treat them. And so ever since then, I've wondered, well, why is this? And I've also had since then, I've had fantastic relationships and treatment experiences with people with BPD. And so there's no reason I can see why this shouldn't be something that is taught. These connections shouldn't be built and this research shouldn't be done. So we got interested in that of how could we maybe adapt something. His intervention is called Boost. And how could we adapt it for people with BPD? So at that point, we brought in an advisory committee of people with lived and living experience of BPD. And we started, I think it took us over a year. We really went step by step in what is the stigma that people are facing with BPD, and how could we help? What could we do to target something very specifically to these people, these folks? And I guess we've been focusing over the past 4 years or so on, there's self-stigma. So this internalized stigma, if you're constantly told, well, you're bad at relationships, you can't handle something, you're too sensitive, you might start to believe, well, people with BPD like me, I'm never going to have a relationship. I'm never going to work. I'm never going to do this. And how does that internalized stigma kind of play out?
And a lot of the time you're like straight up told that.
Yeah.
So of course you're going to think that about yourself.
Yeah, you're told people with BPD are X. And so why, especially like you said, if you're getting a diagnosis at 18, you might say, okay, well, this is it. That I guess this is how I should now start to move my goals and my strategies to expect that kind of discrimination. And we all know about self-fulfilling prophecies that once you expect it, these behaviors start being enacted that make people say, oh, you're just proving, what I said about you.
Exactly.
So self-stigma, institutional stigma, which if a clinic is saying someone has BPD, refer them out, that's institutional stigma, right? And so how does that play out? And then very specifically healthcare provider stigma. So what we know from research is the most stigmatizing people to people with BPD are healthcare workers, nurses, psychiatrists, therapists. Those are where big sources of stigma come from. And so we're currently doing work, my student that I mentioned, looking at healthcare provider stigma as well. So that's how we started. I mean, how we moved into stigma. We research in my lab, and just feeling this kind of connection for people with BPD and wanting to bring them in as peer researchers. The group we now do based on the anti-stigma intervention, I have a person with BPD who co-leads the group with us. And this way I just feel like I'm so lucky every time I interact with anyone on these advisories or do this kind of work. It's been just so valuable, regardless of the research, however it turns out, that I feel like we're making a difference with people. I'm learning a lot, and we're able to kind of continue to get out the message that the explanations for why, all those stigmatizing language that people with BPD hear and receive, we're really trying to have like a counter campaign for it.
That's so important. And having the person with BPD co-lead it is also seen in the evidence a million times, right? Like the contact-based stigma reduction. So, I mean, I think working with healthcare workers makes so much sense because I think that, those are the people who are, administrators, to be fair, are the ones making the decisions about the structural stigma. And also the people that you're being diagnosed by are the ones often telling you, like, you're going to die alone. Nobody's going to love you. You can't get a job. Like all of the things that we've heard before. So how do these groups actually happen? Like, what do they look like?
So our anti-stigma groups, so they're called BPD Boost. right now we're piloting them. So we're in our second round. So we've developed this intervention. It's 8 sessions. They're 90 minutes each, group therapy format. We do them all on Zoom right now, just for accessibility purposes. We're in our second, so we just got the approval to, we're piloting them. So we did our first one in the summer, over the summer months, which was really just absolutely, it was kind of, oh my gosh, it sounds so cheesy. It was like a dream come true. That sounds silly.
It sounds like it.
But it was like, it was so long. And working with this advisory, there's 4 people in the advisory that have been, oh my, like just so wonderful, and like picking apart every detail of this intervention and the research design. So not just the intervention, but the questions we ask in our assessments, everything. So BOOST in terms of the BPD context is overcoming the obstacles of stigmatizing thoughts. So overcoming obstacles, stigmatizing thoughts is the BOOST. And so we kind of have a roadmap of what we do, but we talk about stigma, internalized as well as externalized stigma. We start with these kind of basic coping around mindfulness, distress tolerance, and validation. After we go through connecting a stigma story for everybody, we talk about emotions as kind of the centralized place where distress can live, but also, and I'll tell you, Lori, the thing we've gotten the feedback that people love the most about the group, I'll let the secret sauce out, is that we do a lot of talking about what is good about BPD. Like, what are you glad about the fact that you have BPD? Let's talk about the positive aspects of it. And this is something that people, even if they've been in DBT, they've done this before, they've literally never had conversations about it. Yep. And it's one of the things people get really excited about.
And there's so much. There's so much positive. Like, I would never give this up about myself, because the positives and like, don't get me wrong, the negatives are bad.
Right.
But I think they're outweighed by the positives, truthfully.
It's such a way to take a diagnosis and turn it on its head. That it's a label. At the same time, it's describing your experience in some way or another. We're all people. We all have highs and lows, and like, how has these kind of experiences actually benefited you? And that's been really cool. And then we spend the second half talking about catching stigmatizing thoughts. We talk about how to communicate a diagnosis to someone if you choose to. We talk about like assertiveness, assertive interpersonal styles when you're confronted with stigma. And then we talk about behaviors that can, when you feel that emotion really get high and you're feeling like maybe a not great long-term solution behavior is about to start, how we can counteract that. So those are kind of the skills part that we go through. But really, like, I think, though we don't have the data yet, we did the first group in the summer. We're recording this in December. We're just doing our second session through that started in October or November. Really, it's the connection between people and hearing people's stories. And we have people who have been diagnosed 20 years ago, people who have just gotten a diagnosis, and everyone being able to connect. It's been just really, we've only done 2 groups so far. So we're like less, a dozen people, a little more than that, but just the stories have been really inspiring. And so regardless of how the research side of things turns out, we will be running these groups in the pilot phase for at least a year and a half more.
Right.
But I really feel like it's some kind of valuable experience. I know I'm finding it to be a valuable experience. So that's what the intervention, this anti-stigma intervention is right now. And that's kind of the state of it.
And that's for the self-stigma primarily.
Yes, it's primarily for self-stigma, though we do talk about other kinds of stigma in terms of where maybe your self-stigma came from.
Right.
Yeah, so it is for people who self-identify as having BPD. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we pay people, obviously, for being in the study. There's 2 assessments and stuff. Yeah.
Totally. Are you recruiting right now for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So
sweet.
The only thing that's important is you do have to have like a clinician on file. So because it's a group just focused on anti-stigma, it's that, the research ethics board that we talked about will not let us just give this group to anyone. That you have to assure that you do have a treating clinician in case of emergencies. We haven't had an emergency, but just in case, the research ethics board, that's one of the inclusion criteria, but we run them online.
So you can be anywhere. Is it Canada only, or?
We have a few restrictions. So because of licensing requirements, so it is, we can't treat, because it's operating on my license. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Ontario. So primarily it has to be people that are residing in Ontario.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. That's good to know.
Although we do have lots of other research opportunities for people in any other part of the world.
Okay. Do you want to talk about any of those?
Sure. Like, and if we share like my website, there's a way to just sign up to our research registry where you'll be contacted. And if you're interested, you can do. But we have a study just on self-stigma in general going on that's about to be recruited for. We have the emptiness study that's about to be recruited for. We have a large study on healthcare providers. So if you're a healthcare provider interested in participating in research, we're also doing that. I'm also doing a cross-Canada study on family connections. So for people that are involved with Sash Bear's family connections, a family member, if you have a family member who's involved or you are involved yourself, we've been doing a big project on that, and that goes across Canada.
That's awesome. Sash Bear is such a beautiful organization, isn't it?
I know. It's amazing.
They're just so great. All of them. Like every single person that I've met there. So great.
Yes.
And that's, you were saying about like co-regulation and kind of treating the family as a holistic unit as opposed to individuals. Is that kind of the plan?
Yeah. So we're looking at, if you're in Canada right now and you know anything about family connections, Sash Bear administers family connections for Canada, but family connections is done all over the world. In almost every other place where it's been at least studied, it's done with a clinician leading the family connections group. So family connections are kind of like dialectical behavior therapy, but for family members of people with BPD or people experiencing suicide. Also, they're often done in conjunction with a DBT program for the person with BPD. So we don't know a lot about. In Canada, that's not the case. In Canada, it is full peer-led, which is kind of amazing. So it's more widely available. It's free. It's always led by peers, no clinicians. And then also it's just led fully across Canada, all provinces and territories. And it doesn't have, the person, your loved one doesn't need to be in a DBT program. Some people, have lost contact with their loved one, or they're doing it in order to regain kind of, help them. And
DBT is so inaccessible, right? Like that's a huge barrier.
It's so difficult. So this is the research we're doing is really to show to funding agencies, to people in general that, let's look at the outcome when we take the clinicians out of it and we take the DBT programs out of it, just family connections on its own. And so far, we're just finishing a study. The preliminary results so far are showing that, yes, big effect size of people in family connections. We have 100 people that we've assessed pre and post. And hopefulness goes up, burden goes way down. So experiencing your loved one is burdensome goes way down, and emotion regulation improves significantly in the people, in the family members. So we're really hoping to partner with Sash Bear further and do some more in-depth studies in the future.
And that's so much more scalable.
Yeah.
Like it basically like unlimited scalability compared to having people in DBT and having to pay for it.
It's just it's not feasible to imagine that everyone should get or needs full package DBT. It's just not available. No. But if we can do things that help the family.
I know very few people that have done full DBT.
No, it's, I mean,
and if I think they're mostly in the States. Canadians, unless you're really rich.
Yeah.
I don't know very many people who have done full program at all.
No.
And I think that Alex Chapman's research, I need to reach out to him. I think, or Dr. Chapman, I should say.
Yeah.
His research on, I guess it was 6 months versus 12 years of DBT that he was working
that was
on.
the
I don't know if they
study.
did. Yeah, did they do groups only? Somebody's done research on groups only, haven't they?
So they've done group only here at CAMH. So Shelley McNean's work. She's also part of, she's one of the leads on the FASTER study as well that you're referencing, which is, Alex Chapman as well. And she's done, I think, 20-week group only effectiveness showing, extremely good outcomes. The FASTER study, if I recall, 6 months versus 12 months dose of full, I think it was full package.
It was
DBT.
full program, yeah.
And I think they found really similar findings for 6 months versus 12 months, that you can achieve very similar outcomes in half the time, if that's kind of the structure. Yeah. So there's ways to kind of move forward looking at how to make DBT a little bit more accessible, but it's been a bit tough.
Totally. And even at that, like obviously 6 months versus 12 years. Sometimes it feels like 12 years.
Yeah.
I've been practicing DBT skills for 12 years and it feels like that sometimes.
Yeah.
But I mean, even just if we can get twice as many people through in a year, that's incredible. That's awesome. You've talked about so much cool stuff, but what excites you the most about the work that you do or the research that's happening today around BPD?
I really think, but I've already kind of mentioned this, is it's bringing in people with lived experience into the research, not just the clinical work. I think if we can see that kind of movement, the stigma research is starting to really pick up too. There's some great researchers doing BPD stigma work and some researchers that also have lived experience of BPD that are doing amazing work right now, where not only do we have studies that are like, people with BPD, they feel more stigmatized or are more stigmatized than like comparing them to post-traumatic stress or depression, but we're also really getting into the nuances of it. So we're starting to see that family members of people with BPD experience a lot of stigma. We're starting to see that the difference between, is it the behavior that I'm doing that's being stigmatized, or is it the label itself? And so, what my grad student, she had a paper published recently in Personality Disorders Theory, Research, and Treatment, I believe, PDTRT. And her results were from her master's, but showed that if someone is, doing just nothing really, but they tell someone they have BPD, that's going to increase stigma, right? Yeah. But if they're displaying high distress behaviors and they tell someone they have BPD, this actually it doesn't increase stigma at all. So it's kind of this difference between when you're using the diagnostic label to explain behaviors that seem like high distress behaviors, it actually helps the public understand what's going on and can reduce stigma. Whereas just the label, though floating by itself, not connected to a behavior, that actually can increase stigma. So we're starting to really get into these, think a little bit more nuanced, because we also know that just telling people about BPD, it doesn't always work to reduce stigma, that we have to do something a little bit more. And so there's all these really exciting things that people are looking at social media to see how that exacerbates stigma. They're looking at policy. They're really talking and connecting and valuing the experiences of people with BPD in terms of asking insightful research questions. And I think that's what I'm excited about, is to kind of keep doing that if possible.
Oh, that's really interesting. This research just didn't exist 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it really, we're seeing it coming in a few people, there's definitely across Canada, people are starting to do it, and places in the States are starting to do it. And hopefully this helps. I mean, even talking about how people are trained in school. We're starting to look at that about BPD, right? So there's all these different places that we can intervene and get people more knowledgeable and more empathic and get that information out to the people that need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, school is a huge piece too, because there's actually a school out here with a counseling program, and somebody reached out to me individually and they were like, hey, like this professor that we had for our abnormal psych class or whatever, psychopathology class, was horribly stigmatizing to people with BPD. And their cohort actually, I offered to do it for free, but they ended up giving me like this really beautiful gift to come and like do a class for them off of their regular school about the strengths of BPD and why it's important to like recognize them. And I was like, these are students taking this like huge initiative to come in on a day that they're not working, to have somebody with BPD come in. And it's like, if all schools just had a day where somebody with BPD came in, or even like a person with BPD, like help with their curriculum development, it would make such a big difference. And that sticks with you for a long time. And it can, again, self-fulfilling prophecy for sure.
Yeah, there's some people doing some really good work on thinking about curriculum. And because that's when they analyze how people teach about BPD, like in undergrad, it's, showing videos of, like movie scenes from usually women, fatal attraction, usually, a woman stalking somebody and it's an unfortunate portrayal of, and maybe sometimes people just need to learn better, re-educate faculty, but we have to start talking about it so that it's happening. Absolutely. It happens.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your work is doing that already, which is so important. So speaking of strengths about BPD, the last question I always ask people with BPD, I ask what their favorite part of living with BPD is. But what do you like most about working with people with BPD?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, if I think about lately, like doing our work in BPD Boost, the way the way that people with BPD, at least those that I've seen in group recently, have been able to describe their emotional kind of inner worlds with the most beautiful and detailed metaphors and language has been, I wish we could just like publish it or make a poem or do something, but the way I've heard people kind of describe the push and pull or the inner struggle of having these really strong emotions in all these different areas, it's just been moving. And so much of, I feel like modern day life is like on a cell phone or zoned out and numbing, that to connect in with people that for the good and the bad of it can feel and are like in that feeling in that moment has just been a really awesome way for me to step back and kind of reconsider life values and how to keep making a difference, even thinking about ways to like teach my children, I think even as all parents should learn about these kinds of things, because we're so often as parents being like, oh, stop, you're fine, quiet down,
totally,
shush, don't bother me, why are you crying? And really being able to step back, I feel like has even made me think, okay, it's okay to feel these emotions. We're so scared of negative emotions that, I don't know. It's been just this wonderful experience of really getting to listen to people, which of course I've always done that as a clinician, but this being able to step back and really give people just, instead of as a clinician, you're like, okay, how do we help? What's going on right now? What's the next thing? Talking just about stigma, we're really able to explore like, what does that mean for people? And it feels a little bit different, I think, to me in this way.
Well, and I'm sure as a clinician, you're probably not talking about stigma as a concept as often.
No.
More so the impacts of stigma and how to work through them, which is very different.
Yeah. And usually when people are coming to session, even if it's group, they're like, okay, this is what I want to work on. They're not like, usually people aren't coming into treatment to talk about stigma. So it's not, you talk about what people want to talk about.
Yeah.
But this has allowed us to kind of like step back and I don't know. I think even before this group, I've always been interested. I've always been studying BPD because it has always seemed unfair to me how people with BPD are treated. And I've been interested in figuring it out and helping and understanding more about the disorder. And then this is talking about stigma now. I feel like it's a good time in my career, having done a lot of research on treatment or BPD in general, to really talk about that nuanced, difficult experience of how people with BPD kind of sit in larger society. So it's been great.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on the show, all of your allyship, honestly, like so much gratitude to you for that. It's incredible. And I hope our paths cross again in the future. I'm sure they will in some way.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much. Same for all the things that you're doing here. It's very exciting.
Thank you so much for listening to the Superfeeler podcast. This episode was recorded on the unceded traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you are interested in learning more about the show, please feel free to follow us on social media. Our Instagram handle is the Superfeeler. That'll be also linked in the show notes. We also have a Patreon page where you can get all sorts of bonus content. We've got bonus episodes, video episodes, lots of resources, journal articles, all sorts of stuff. So you're going to absolutely love being on Patreon with us. There's also free memberships in addition to paid ones, so please feel free to join that. That's patreon.com/superfeeler. If you're looking for information regarding the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support group that I mentioned in the show, please feel free to Google or look at laurieedmondson.com for information and registration.